industry association. We represent about 800 mobile operators worldwide, who among them connect more than 4 billion unique subscribers. Now, today's format is very much intended to be a very open and inclusive session, so please do feel free to interact and ask questions and share your views. To start off the conversation, we've invited 6 distinguished speakers to give us their perspectives. They all come from a quite diverse stakeholder group. So to start off, we've got Mila Romanov, who's a legal specialist on data protection and privacy at the UN Global Pulse, and she's joining us remotely from New York. Then we've got Miguel Calderon on my left, who's Vice President of Regulatory and Corporate Affairs at Telefónica Mexico, followed by Michelle Reverand, advisor to the President and CEO of Orange Group. Then Alexandrine de Corbion, Advocacy Officer at Privacy International. Then Fernando Sosa, DG of Protection of Rights and Sanctions at Mexico's Data Protection Authority, the INAI. And last but not least, Boris Voitan, Director of Privacy at the GSMA. Now, before I hand over to the speakers, just to briefly introduce our topic, I'm sure we would all agree that big data involves at least 3 things. One, it's about combining data from multiple sources, analyzing them, and hopefully coming up with insights that help inform decisions in various contexts. Now, today, our focus is using mobile-derived big data to inform decisions, but specifically in the social good context. Now, what do I mean by social goods? Well, it's about life-enhancing services, whether it's predicting and monitoring epidemics, saving people's lives after disasters, tracking population displacements, urban planning, traffic management, and so on. Now, unsurprisingly, a number of mobile operators and their partners are working on a number of big data for social good initiatives, leveraging on data that they have access to, including sensors, cell tower data, data about how their customers use mobile networks, and so on. Clearly, where personal data is involved, there are established and well-known privacy-enhancing technologies that everyone has been using to ensure that any privacy concerns and risks are mitigated. So, and I'm sure the speakers will touch on this in a minute. But I guess what we'd like to focus on today is how do we move the needle forward and move beyond the small-scale projects to something bigger and achieve scalability and sustainability in big data for social good initiatives. So yes, I guess the first question I'd like to pose to Mila, Miguel, and Michelle is, what does big data for social good mean for your organizations, and what are some of the success factors that led to a real impact in people's lives? So Mila, over to you in New York first. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I assume everyone can hear me well. It's a pleasure. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go on.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in such a distinguished panel. First, I would like to introduce myself and a little bit about the organization that I work for. Next slide, please. I'm a legal and privacy specialist at the United Nations Global Pulse, which is a special initiative of the UN Secretary General. Our initiative has been established to understand and explore how big data could be harnessed for public and social good, mainly in the development and humanitarian context, and how such data could be harnessed in a responsible, privacy-protective way. So, as you know, in 2014, I'm not sure if you can see the slides, but next slide, please. In 2015, member states came together and passed the Sustainable Development Goals. And Sustainable Development Goals is a set of goals that try to address the most pending issues around the world: hunger, health, climate change, gender equality, peace, justice, and security, and so forth. So we are trying to understand how big data sources coming mainly from non-traditional data sources such as mobile phone data, social media data, data collected from postal transactions or financial transactions could be used for understanding how, for example, people are struggling with unemployment or other economic issues, or how, for example, mobile phone data could be used to understand and help a disaster response. In our team, we have data scientists, data engineers, policy specialists, and we work with a variety of humanitarian and development agencies that try to tackle these issues with the help of big data coming from these various sources. If we go to the next slide and then go on to the next slide, there are a few projects that I'm happy to share with you, and mainly because the panel is organized by the GSMA, I thought the most relevant would be to actually showcase how mobile phone data, mainly anonymized mobile phone data, could be used to understand development or to understand and assist humanitarian action. So at Global Pulse, we worked to understand, for example, how anonymized transactions data could be used to understand traffic patterns. In Jakarta, for example, we, with the people calling in the morning and people calling at night, could actually show where the most congested areas are. And this would help the Ministry of Transportation to understand which additional routes for transportation planning they should consider in the next year, for example. On to the next slide, if you will see two maps. And one map show actually how anonymized mobile transaction, anonymized call detail records actually could be used to understand disease spread. In a small African country, we used anonymized call detail records, which actually were correlated with the direct evidence of where, for example, certain cases of disease spiked up. And such evidence showed that data, and at that time aggregated to very high level, could also show how people are moving from one area to another, and that actually correlated with how the disease was spread when it was compared to or combined when it was compared to and correlated with the actual disease spread provided by the Ministry of Health. Another project which we've done also with the use again of anonymized mobile transactions data is actually understand and help, and that project was done with the World Food Program. Again, if you see the slides, it would be the next slides. If not, I'll explain it briefly. But it's basically, again, anonymized call detail records were used to understand how people are moving before the floods in Mexico and Tabasco floods and after the floods. And the transactions were again correlated with the actual floods and the movement patterns provided by the emergency services on the ground. And it proved that actually anonymized call detail records could show how people are moving at the time of shortly after the disaster, which could provide humanitarians with very critical information in real time on how to respond in a case of an emergency. Another use of same anonymized call detail records for actually understanding how many people are calling could also be used in the humanitarian context. For example, understanding how many people are calling at one point versus how many people are calling at the time of a disaster could alert emergency responders that something is happening. So in one of our projects, for example, we correlated or we compared how people are reacting during Christmas and how much they're calling their relatives. And of course, there was a huge spike in their behavior, in their calling behavior. But then, for example, during the Tabasco floods, there was another huge spike, which at a regular time wouldn't occur. So if such emergency preparedness mechanisms were actually implemented, this could save much more time for the humanitarians to understand how people should, how people are behaving and that something is happening, so they could respond on time. So of course, big data presents many risks, and there are many opportunities, but there are also many challenges and also risks. And the panel dedicated to privacy is the right one, because without the privacy protective techniques, we cannot really harness big data, and we cannot utilize it for public good. And there are many projects where, for example, when you understand the risks and when you understand the harms that could be presented versus the benefits that you, for example, can draw from the analysis of big data, you sometimes have to say no. So at Global Pulse, we also have a privacy program, and if we go on to the next slide, it will show you just a few activities that we do in the privacy sector, in the privacy program. So we embed privacy by design in all of our projects. We have privacy and principles and guidelines. And mainly, we're also working on innovation tools, that is to say, in technology-wise, in understanding, for example, quantifying the risks of re-identification and the right level of aggregation that is needed for the humanitarian and development experts to utilize the data and yet get its value for example, disaster response or for disease spread, and yet preserve its privacy and not get more data than you actually need. And we are also developing policy and building capacity within the organization on understanding the right principles that apply actually to big data. And I'm actually just happy to announce today we published a big data guide to how harness data for development. And as part of that guide, we released a checklist or a tool for risk assessment. And another just recent development is that we also released a report, our first report on big data for public good, for SDGs, which was produced based on the discussions of the Privacy Advisory Group that we also established to understand and bring in all of the experts from around the world on the main challenges and gaps that exist within big data and privacy. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I don't have any more time, so I'm happy to answer any questions in the questions section. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Mila. I think let's move on to Miguel and Michelle, and then we can invite questions from the audience in a few minutes. Thanks again.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, everybody. I promise you I didn't do a copy-paste of Mila's presentation, but what you're going to what you're going to see, it's very much alike. So, yes, the UN has set 17 social development goals for 2030. Yes, big data is a huge opportunity to measure progress and shape policies in some of those goals. Big data can help us to prevent hunger, to promote health, to promote sustainable cities, to act against poverty. And I'm going to show you some examples that we have done in Mexico with big data. But before that, what we have done in Telefónica is we have developed a platform. We call it Luca. We have been able to get different competences that we didn't have in the past, of data warehouse, of data mining. We also have done a lot of things into the research and development. And with this platform that we want to launch next February at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona with the GSMA, basically we want to use also this engine, this tool that we have, this platform, to develop new products and new projects for in big data for social good. So what have we done so far with this? Let me tell you the example of the swine flu in Mexico in 2009. Basically, we had a big pandemic flu, and the health organizations in Mexico didn't know exactly where the flu was spreading. So through mobile phones and asking the customer permission to provide the information and actually asking them to answer a survey, we could tell the government very quickly where was the flu coming and how it was moving around the country. And that helped the government to put in place different mechanisms to try to prevent the flu and try to attack the flu where the pandemic was originating. Already Mila talked about the floods in Tabasco, and basically this with the information that our towers provided, we could identify how the people were moving according to the flu, and then we can tell the government where to put the shelters, for example, to receive the people, and how to act and how to attend the people that was affected by the flu. The same information is about the earthquake. We have plenty of earthquakes in Mexico, so this information can let us know how people are moving, where are the biggest disaster zones, and also with the government we can help them provide that information to assist the people. Also we have done different projects around the world, in Spain mainly for tourism, for example providing tourism indicators in Valencia to encourage how to move and how to redirect the traffic of people. So, but basically, I think that the concern is, okay, if we want to continue doing this big data for social good, what are the questions, what are the challenges that we have? And first, from a private organization, obviously the first question that our marketing people are saying is, could this cannibalize commercial opportunities? If I provide this for free, can I cannibalize my commercial opportunities? And if data is my biggest asset, why should I be opening it up? The other concern is obviously to fulfill all the legal regulation. In Telefónica, we're very concerned about data protection. We're very concerned about the privacy of the data of our users. And therefore, we normally ask people, and we all the time ask the people if we can use their data and why are we using their data for, and obviously anonymizing that data. And what if the competition get hold of my data? That is the other concern. Could this harm my reputation, even if it's for social good? If one of these projects, some people do not like this project? And what if the anonymization process is not rigorous enough? So some of the questions, some of the answers to those questions are, well, basically, we're trying to see, we want to develop big data for social good. I think it's working. We need to be there. There might be, I mean, not necessarily this has to be for free. Everything we have done so far is for free, but we are very open and we're looking at how this is going to evolve. Security, we are a member of the OPAL organization, and I think my other colleagues are going to talk more deeply about this, but basically this is bringing the algorithm to the data, not taking the data out of our secure premises. And definitely the way to go is with public-private partnerships, and we have been doing public-private partnerships with a lot of organizations in order to develop different programs and different opportunities for this. And I think I have my 8 minutes already.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Over to Michel.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having invited Orange into this workshop. Of course, we are completely on the same line of the two first presentation we have, and in particular with Telefónica, and that's why now we are participating. We are acting in the same project for inviting a kind of new step in what we call the OPAL project that you work. In fact, we have, I think, more or less the same approach and the same history than Telefónica in this area. We identify for years now that big data could get a lot of advantages for understanding any kind of social reality, especially in the development and related to ODD, of course, but not only in a sense. And we decided years ago to see what can we do with this and how we can work on this. So we begin with a working group 5 years ago now around the idea of data for development. It was a very large partnership in which we participate, with, in particular with a lot of university, with a lot of research and scientific projects. We work on Senegal and Ivory Coast as two experimental approach, and in very close association with all of the local actors, because of course it is very touchy point. All of the local institutions, ministry, agencies, and so on were completely associated to this. We see what could happen on many sectors: health, agriculture, transportation, urban planning, energy, statistics, and we work with different universities to elaborate more than 100 experimental scientific projects all over the world, in a sense, with many partners, with the data from Orange. The results has been 6 projects financed by the Gates Foundation, more or less in the same kind of area, in the same kind of concept. We work on malaria, trying to have a better understanding of the growing, of the dynamic process of the disease, of the epidemic, and in particular the impact of the human mobility in the region, in Senegal. We work on the statistic, in particular to have a better understanding of socio-economic, socio-cultural profile of the population, is a much more precise identification of the diversity of the situations that we had before. And we work on agriculture to follow the livestock movement, to follow the agricultural production, the state of agricultural production, and trying to have an idea of what could be the food resources necessary in the coming months. We consider that this experience was really a success. We get more precise knowledge than we had before. We get the capacity to understand the evolution and of the situation, and not only to have a single picture. We clearly identify a common interest of many locals, international university actors, and I think we avoid all of the difficulty, all of the challenges we may imagine, we may identify before. Of course, everything about privacy and the possibility of using data for this kind of more global social experiments. As a conclusion, Orange begin to participate in a certain number of working groups around the world of this issue, for example, also with the OECD Paris 21 statistical process and so on. So we're now trying to prepare the next step in what we call the OPAL concept, which try to take stock of all the conclusion of this former experience. It is a research pilot that we try to develop in a very large partnership. Partners we were on board with us in the first steps. We work with the MIT, we work with the World Economic Forum, we work with ODA, many universities in UK, of course Telefonica, and we are anyway open to work with more actors which could be interested, telecom, business actor, but also, of course, all the international institutions who may want to share this approach. The idea, it's OPAL, so it means open algorithm, and the components of the project are as follow. We work not directly with data, but we will propose access to this algorithm to all institutions which could be interested by this. The idea is to work first with data from Orange, but open to work with all of the other actors, telco in particular. We begin with Senegal. We work in Senegal. We constitute a global framework of interested actors to make the project understand as well as possible by all the local actors, including, of course, government, NGOs, local authority, and so on. We go on working very closely in partnership with the university interested in a steering committee. We organize a steering committee with a major partner I presented before, but also more and more the World Bank, also global partnership, also UNFPA, to try to enlarge this approach. And now Orange is concentrating on the Senegal, and we are in a partnership with Telefonica. We will do the same exercise, if I may say, in Colombia. Now we got some finance from Agence Française de Développement, both for Telefonica and Orange project. But of course, we may go further on this. We hope to be able to have a first algorithm mid next year, mid 2017. I think it is the point. So in practice, the general idea is that all of the institutions could be interested by having data and working on data for development could ask to Opal, to the consortium. So we need such or such data. We try to produce the data in this collective algorithm process, and we deliver the expected knowledge, increased knowledge, to the institution which could be interested. So we will move in this project, in these pilot projects now. We are moving now. We expect first pilot results next summer, and we'll see how we could move on. Of course, we have a lot of ambition of this. Now the issue is who can finance, who won't finance this kind of project. Of course, if we want to have a very large issue, we begin on one country. With some institution, we could imagine to reproduce it on many countries and make it an open tool for everybody. We would like to use this tool for the development. So it's research pilot project, and we hope that in the coming months we get more and more interest, more and more support, and it could be used as a basis for all of the institutions, all of the companies who could be interested in this. Maybe you want to add something? Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. I think all three speakers gave some really nice examples, bringing to life what they mean by big data for social good. And it's actually refreshing to hear that operators are working together and moving beyond single operator solutions to something that involves more and more partners working together. So that's great. Now, before we move to the next three speakers and touching on privacy in greater detail, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions, both in the audience or online. So any contributions? Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Lucy Purden from Privacy International, and I had a question for Miguel from Telefonica. I think you said that you sought consent from customers to be able to use the data in the study that you did, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you managed to get consent from the customers.
Well, for example, in the swine flu, as I said, it was a survey. So basically, through messaging, we asked the customer if they wanted to participate in this effort, and they did. Basically, it was that. The data of the customers was not revealed. It was all, I was, all anonymized and all put into an statistics just to understand where the flu epidemic was, but there was no singularity of saying this person has the flu or not, for example.
Were customers able to opt out if they didn't want to have their data as part of that survey?
Yeah, my colleague here, Fernando, he works for the INAI. In Mexico, we have what we call the ARCO rights. So yes, the customer have the right to pull back their data. This is by law.
And just one more question. How many customers do you have in Mexico? How many people?
Well,
did
we
you
have
reach?
26 million customers in Mexico, but that time in 2009, maybe we had less than 15 million. And I mean, we had the survey, we have a big enough sample to understand the problem. No?
Do you know how many people participated in the end? How many people participated in the end out of your customers?
I can't recall right now, but I can give you the information later.
Thank you very much. Another question? Yeah, the front there, please. The lady, and then the lady at the back.
Thank you. My question was about the Opal project. I think it's a really interesting one. Like, it really allows lots of things to happen. At the same time, I was wondering, how do you ensure the privacy of users, and well, who do you plan to have access to those data? Because with the new technologies today, it's also possible to begin to aggregate like anonymized information and to have like information that is not supposed to be identifiable to become identifiable. So how do you ensure that that does not happen in the future?
It's a question for Miguel or Michelle.
No, of course it is a problem for everyone in this kind of issue. At this time, we don't explicitly add to the people, do you want, do you agree with using of the data? Data has been used in a manner which guarantee absolute confidentiality for individual, for groups, and so on. We work very closely with all of the local actors. We move step by step with governments, local authorities, NGOs, development agency, and so on, to see if it could be a real issue. The technical approach of the data, the technical treatment of the data, algorithm now, collective large treatment before, was organized on a pure scientific basis and with specific technical approach. I'm not at all a technician for this, but with specific technical approach which guarantee that it would not be possible to identify the people, and also specific groups, also two specific groups. And clearly we have a challenge on what are the level of details that we want to add to interpret some mechanism. Well, at what point is it possible to identify a specific village, a specific community, even if we know that it may be part of the issue in a sense. So clearly we are in a kind of experimental approach. We are not at all opposed of the idea of asking to the people, do you accept that your personal data may be used in a collective approach for this? We absolutely agree on this, but it's a very important part of this experiment, of this pilot dimension. At this time, it was only this technical treatment by scientists, which at the end completely guarantees the confidentiality, but at this time there has not been a difficulty, and all what has been made now, clearly I think that everybody considers that what we gain, what's much more important, that the risk could be behind this. But we are open to any kind of organization, any kind of management approach to guarantee this at this time.
maybe just on that, like you talk about risk, do you have any impact assessment about what the risk could be on the misuse of those informations?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of your. So I missed the beginning of your question. So.
Yes, I said, do you have any impact assessment at the moment about how this information could be misused?
Well, if you want to use it as personal information, certainly, at the end, it may be possible. I don't know, but it's the issue of legal organization of all of this, and of course, some kind of scientific ethics, that scientific moral, which is behind all of this, because now the treatment is made in the laboratory of university in particular.
May I? In Mexico, and in many countries where Telefónica operates, there is a data protection law and a privacy law. We call it in Mexico the privacy protection law of the private information in property of private organizations. And therefore, you have to build a plan and you have to fulfill certain requirements. Maybe Fernando will talk about that later. But basically, we need to provide the INAI, which is the regulator in this case. We need to provide all the contingency methods, plans that we have. We need to protect the information. We need to train our employees how to deal with that private information. You have the ARCO rights, the right for the people to authenticate, change, or take down their data if they want to. So it's heavily regulated. Now, having said that, what we're trying to do here is precisely with this program of OPAL, trying to anonymize those private data and try to use it for different projects, and in this case, for the social good. I don't know if that answered a little bit the question.
So I'm just conscious of time. So can we just, because we've started talking about privacy, which is the next sort of item on the agenda. So can we keep the remaining questions for the end, please? I mean, we've already started talking about these issues, but Alexandrine, then Fernando, then Boris, it'd be good to get your thoughts on what are the key privacy considerations when talking about big data for social goods, and you know, how can we talk about privacy in a way that this can be an enabler rather than a barrier to using big data in ways that actually enhance people's lives. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for having us on this panel. We've been having this discussion with the GSM Association and some of the fellow panelists for a few years now. And I'll be pointing out things that remain of concern and things where we're seeing that are of increasing concern as well. In the question that was posed, there are two elements. I'll be treating them separately. The first one is around the key privacy considerations for big data and social good initiatives. And the second part is how privacy can be an enabler in those initiatives. So with regards to the first part of the questions around the key privacy considerations for big data, when we're talking about big data, when it comes down to it, it's about personal information, the generation, use, collection, and as the definition given by Yanis earlier, the application of analytical techniques to search that data, to aggregate it and cross-reference it. And so when we think about personal data and the protection of it, and ultimately the protection of the privacy of the data subject, it comes down to data protection and having a rigorous framework to balance the privacy protection with the public interest sought as part of that social good initiative. Unfortunately, when we're talking about big data, it's still very unclear as to what data sets we're talking about, the sources of that data. And so it means that we're pushing the boundaries of the existing legal frameworks that are in place that can provide those protection mechanisms. And so we're having to ask ourselves, how can those initiatives be regulated what is the current trend in the situation when there is little or no regulation already in place. So there are many countries in the world where there is either no data protection law or it's not enforced the way it should be. So in those contexts, it's already very, very difficult because we're starting with the starting point is that there isn't enough protections. And then, like I was saying, with big data, we're thinking about bigger uses of data, other elements coming in around the use of algorithms, the use of publicly accessible information, which we could be arguing for a long time as to what that actually means. There's a lot of discussion as to what is publicly available information and what can be used and by whom and for what purpose. And so the debate today is still very much about how do we include in the discussions, because obviously we're not against the purposes of the social good initiatives, what was discussed by UN Global Pulse, Telefonica and Orange. These are all social problems we want to be solving, that we need to be solving around poverty reduction, giving access to public services for especially vulnerable groups in society. But at the same time, we cannot sideline what the potential concerns might be, what the existing concerns are about how these are impacting fundamental rights and also some of the ethical values we have in our societies. Those can't be undermined or understated in relation to the benefits that are sought by those different initiatives. So when it comes to there are three points that I wanted to highlight before going to some of the specific data protection privacy concerns. One I've already touched upon was around the structural regulatory problems where data protection is weak or not existent. But also when we're talking about the different actors that presented today and that are involved in these different initiatives, we have development agencies, humanitarian agencies. It's unclear how they are implementing the law, or are they operating outside the law? Are they then putting in place specific regulations to oversee their activities? Is it through bilateral agreements? There's still very much a lack of transparency as to how those initiatives are designed and how the privacy data protection principles are implemented within those. The second point was around the multiple actors. And I know it was promoted as something good that an increasing amount of actors are coming into this space, but that also means that the complexity of the situation is increasing as well, because we have the donors who fund the initiatives. We have the host governments where those initiatives are being deployed on their territories. We've got the telecommunication service providers who provide the data. We've got the international NGOs or INGOs who run and implement the programs. And then increasingly with the use of algorithms in some of the projects presented by Orange, we've got the designers, the technologists who are behind the creation, use, and implementation of those systems. And so that all raises questions around accountability, transparency, and then also avenues for recourse when there are violations of how that data is being used. These are all questions that are still pending, that haven't been answered. The last point before going to the specific privacy concern I want to make is the discussions we're having today are very much, we need to think about who the beneficiaries are. A lot of the time, because of the context in which we're having these initiatives, these are vulnerable groups within their own society or people that have been forced to move, that are in transit, in migration. And so we need to take that into account because there's an additional level of duty of care to those individuals who are put in that vulnerable position. It's possible, we're seeing as well that the individuals in those circumstances are not empowered to understand the implications of providing their data, and also if there's an opportunity, I was mentioned in a question, to opt out as well. Can they push back on the demands to give their data when it comes to choosing between being safe from floods and being relocated or not, and what kind of choices are individuals actually given? In terms of the data protection privacy principles, I wanted to run through a few, and I'm sure my colleague on the left will mention a few as well when it comes to data protection. So just mentioning a few that I wanted to highlight, particularly around consent, which was already discussed earlier in the session, around how do we ensure that the individual is given the opportunity, the space, the environment to be able to consent freely, to provide their information. Like I said earlier, we've had this discussion for many years now, but something that has changed recently, and the factors might be, there are probably one or two, it's not only people that are communicating. It's not just the information we provide and that we generate when we communicate, but our devices themselves are also generating data. And this is only information that's appearing and that's becoming more common in the public space recently. There's two aspects of that. Either we're generating more data as well because of the way our devices are built and the way we use them, but also there's more data being generated without the knowledge even of the ones who create the devices, but also of the user. So that's really important to know as well, to understand that it's not when you ask for consent and you give your consent, people might assume that it's just the information that they're aware of revealing, when actually there's a whole set of data that they might not even be aware that actually they're consenting to various actors using. The other one that was already touched upon as well was anonymity. There was mention of absolute confidentiality in the data sets that were used. And I'm challenging that a little bit because there's been several studies about re-identification. Using 2 to 3 data sets, you're able to re-identify individuals. And linking that to the point I made about who is it that we're actually talking about. These are individuals of societies, groups in society that are put in a vulnerable position, be it that they're fleeing conflict or otherwise. And so we really need to take into account that possibility of re-identification. If it falls into the wrong hands and those individuals can be identified, we really need to consider what the risk could be to that. The other two I wanted to mention was around the quality of the data. There's very much this buzz that in the public discourse around these issues that the data is truth, that more data will bring in more advantages, more benefits to society. But we forget that behind all of this generation, creation, processing, and use of data, even in the creation of the algorithms, there's a human being behind that. And that means that there's room for politicization of the data, misinterpretation of the data, and the data being used as an authoritative truth when actually there are concerns around whether the data collected is actually relevant. We're seeing in some of the examples even that were given, and I'll happily chat to Orange and Telefonica about that, with data sets of a certain group being used to then inform decisions that then will impact a different group whose data was actually not used in the initial generation of that decision-making process. So then it raises question about whether the results that emerge from the systems or the algorithms used, whether they actually reflect the reality of the targeted group. So there's around quality of the data is really important to consider as well. The link to that as well is around discrimination. So when you're collecting data around specific groups, often they're the ones you have chosen, they're targeted for a specific reason. In this context, we're talking about social good initiatives, so it could be beneficiaries of those, but we're seeing that we're also collecting data about specific groups based on racial biased starting points, and so that's problematic as well. Then there's also the problem of exclusion. We assume as well that everyone has a digital footprint, that everyone is generating data, when actually, again, linking back to the groups we might be helping in various settings, especially in humanitarian situation or in post-conflict context. A lot of people might not be generating that data, and then again, there's this issue as to what data is being used to inform and impose and implement policies and decisions that will impact those individuals. The last point I wanted to make on the privacy and data protection aspect is more of a generic one around transparency. There's still very much a lack of information as who the actors are. I gave a few examples, but I'm sure actually there are many more examples. There are intermediaries along this process that we might not be aware of. There's a lack of transparency as to how the data is then being used. We're already seeing with the use of various user data, mobile data for social good, that it's actually already a secondary purpose. So how many more purposes come after that? And then how do you ensure consent and protection and implementation of all the data protection principles that are in place? So there's issue of transparency, especially in the context in which we're having these discussions, where there's an abuse of power from governments, but also companies, as to how they can use data, how they're using it, and who they're sharing it with. We really need to think about how do we address this issue of transparency. Quickly relating to the second part of the question about how privacy can be an enabler of social good initiatives. The data revolution is there. It's been here for a long time, and it's definitely part of the solution to many things that we're trying to solve, but it is not the solution. So it's really important to consider what other elements need to be put in place to be able to fully maximize on the benefits of all these different initiatives. And the last point I want to make on that is around evaluation and audit of all these social good initiatives. Are we considering and reevaluating how successful they have been? What were the failures and benefits? And how do we assess to ensure that we're not making the same mistakes over and over again? Particularly how hard it is to have a data trail. So the data have a life cycle that are very hard to trace. How do we ensure that that process is transparent so that we can understand what the implications are from the point of collection to the point of multiple uses in the future?
Great, thanks, Alexandrine. So just swiftly over to hear the regulator's perspective. So, Fernando, over to you.
Muchas gracias. Me da un gusto estar aquí y voy a retomar mi participación atendiendo a las dudas que han empezado a expresar aquí los asistentes. En primer punto, nunca puede entenderse a la privacidad como un obstáculo para cualquier circunstancia. La privacidad, por lo menos en nuestro país, está establecida como un derecho fundamental. Entonces, cualquier actividad que se tenga que realizar tiene que verse como un derecho fundamental, concomitante y necesario para los ciudadanos. En esta lógica, es muy claro que cualquier recopilación de información tiene que garantizar ciertos estándares mínimos, como mi compañera a la derecha había mencionado. Primero, el consentimiento. El consentimiento es muy importante porque no es, por lo menos en México, la misma forma de recabar el consentimiento en tratándose de datos sensibles como datos de salud, como datos generales. Entonces, cualquier sistema de obtención de información tendría que preguntarse: si hay datos de salud, el consentimiento tiene que ser expreso y por escrito. Dos, debe también tener muy claro unos esquemas de medidas de seguridad. Es decir, si no cumple con las 3 medidas de seguridad necesarias, pues esa compilación de información pues ya tiene un problema en tratándose la privacidad. Y por último, las dos dudas que planteaban acá. Toda información vinculada a Big Data creo que debe estar vista siempre con base a dos principios: el principio de calidad y, desde luego, el principio de finalidad. La información que deben tener siempre debe ser exacta, completa y pertinente. Y el que recaba esa información tiene, por obligación legal, que establecer todos los mecanismos necesarios para mantener esa información en ese término de exactitud, completud y pertinencia. Y desde luego que la información que se obtiene debe ser recabada para los fines a que va a ser aplicada, que es otro punto también que es muy importante para Big Data. Ok, se recopila información para un fin determinado, pues debe ser aplicado para ese fin solamente. Si se cambia el fin, entonces estamos ante un problema del principio de finalidad. Cuando uno empieza como órgano regulador a plantear este tipo de, digamos, de requisitos mínimos o estándares mínimos que deben cumplir para obtener la información, suele entenderse como impedimentos. Yo no lo veo como impedimentos, lo veo como lo mínimo que deben tener para que esa información cumpla con un fin, no solo legal, sino un fin de completud social. Entonces, ¿qué enfoque podemos nosotros proponer para que se entienda a la privacidad vinculante a los esquemas de Big Data? Pues precisamente un esquema pensado en administración de riesgos. Desde que se expidió, por lo menos en nuestro país, la Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en posesión de particulares, las empresas pueden adoptar sistemas voluntarios de autorregulación, mismos que pueden ellos ahí establecer su análisis de riesgos con base a la información que obtienen y las obligaciones legales que deben cumplir. Todas esas empresas que quieran o busquen adoptar esquemas autorregulatorios pueden abarcar cualquier tópico, desde salud hasta tecnologías de la información y el financiero, y pueden redefinir sus prioridades respecto a qué debe ser protegido, con qué objetivos y sobre todo cómo deben protegerse y quién es el responsable. Es este enfoque de administración de riesgos que busca maximizar los beneficios sociales de los flujos de información para minimizar los efectos adversos que afecten la disponibilidad, integridad o confidencialidad de la información. En tal sentido, implica entonces una transformación en la toma de decisiones de empresas y organizaciones sociales. Yo creo que este esquema de autorregulación como una forma, como un enfoque de administración de riesgos puede aminorar estas preguntas desde un punto de vista de transparencia social. Es decir, las empresas transparentan los esquemas que están vinculados a la obtención, manejo, proceso y distribución de su información. Y esto precisamente va vinculado a que el ciudadano tenga las mejores condiciones para ejercer su derecho a la autodeterminación informativa. Yo creo, y es a título personal, que quizás el impedimento que ha habido para que estos esquemas de autorregulación puedan tener fortaleza es que no han visto los beneficios sociales que esto implica y que, desde luego, también es un efecto social de lo mismo. Entonces, yo no puedo ver jamás a la privacidad, entendida en México como una protección de datos personales, como un obstáculo para el Big Data. Si se va a emplear bien la información, tiene que emplearse cumpliendo con los mínimos y los estándares constitucionales y legales. Solo así puede entenderse que hay un uso social adecuado de este fenómeno de Big Data. Gracias.
Gracias, Fernando. Thank you very much. And to finish off, going to Boris Wojtan from the GSMA in London. Boris, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great, we can hear you perfectly. So over to you.
Okay, great. So, hi everyone. I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about how big data for social good and privacy can play nicely together. So I've got three thoughts. The first thought is that really big data for social good is first and foremost a moral question. You think the costs of computing and infrastructure and hosting have come down so dramatically over the last few years, and the expertise in analytics and the sophistication of analytics has increased so dramatically that we now have an opportunity that has opened up, and we have to ask ourselves, should we use this data that we have to improve people's lives? Should we use it to stop suffering? And of course the answer is yes. Of course we should do that. But that doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are other moral imperatives or moral considerations to take into account, and privacy is one of those. So should we protect people's privacy? Yes, of course we should do that. But my point here is that these two moral considerations don't operate in opposition to each other necessarily. They can work very well together. In fact, if we get privacy right, if we design privacy into our proposals and solutions, if we can get transparency right, then actually we can make big data for social good. We can make the outcomes of that better because we bring people along with us on the journey, and there's more trust in the whole ecosystem. The second thought is that privacy principles are an enabler for big data for social good, and they're the perfect place to start, because I think we'll find ourselves increasingly working across operator, across geographies, across diverse use cases, and across a very complicated legal landscape if you drill down to sort of country level laws. But actually, what organizations need is simplicity and scalability. So if we start with the privacy principles that lace their way through all the privacy laws around the world, you will encounter these privacy principles again and again. They've become familiar to us. Then if we start with that, then that provides a little bit of clarity and simplicity for us. And yes, it doesn't get you 100% compliance in every country, but it is a good place to start to get most of your privacy thinking done. And of course, privacy principles are flexible and dynamic, technology neutral, and sector neutral. So it's now up to us as an industry and as NGOs and as governments and policymakers and anyone who is involved in big data for social good to apply those privacy principles in the context of big data. What we don't need is a whole new rule set or legislation that just regulates this. What we need to do is take those privacy principles and apply them in this context. And so that brings me to my third thought or section, which is how we at GSMA and in the mobile industry are thinking about these issues, and how do we see the application of the privacy principles in the big data for social good context. Well, the starting point for me is always going to be the mobile privacy principles, which are essentially our version of the privacy principles that you would find generally, but translated into the context of the mobile industry. And we agreed those and published those a few years ago, and they're general, but that is our direction of travel, and I think it's always our bedrock that we should refer back to. Then a few years ago, we had the Ebola crisis, and there was a sudden urgent need to access telco data and that governments wanted and various organizations. And we very quickly had to come up with some guidelines, some sort of parameters that set out how this could take place in a sensible, privacy-friendly way. And we managed to do that very quickly, partly, I'd like to think, because we have mobile privacy principles and our members are very privacy aware. And then more recently, we have published a public policy position on big data and privacy, which is, again, it's quite high level, but it sets out how we are thinking about this and how we are trying to balance the sort of competing demands. Right now, there are sort of two things going on. GSMA is working with a lot of its members who are already themselves working on big data for social good, and you've heard some of them speak already today, and there are others. And we're working with them to try and leverage that to really demonstrate how this can work and how we can overcome these kind of challenges and make a success of it. And the other thing that's happening at the moment is that we are discussing, thinking through, and trying to figure out how we take these privacy considerations to the next level. What do we think about that? And the sort of considerations that we're talking about here, or the way we'd like to think about it, I'm surmising, is that we can enable big data for social good if, and then you come across all these things. So we can enable big data for social good if we understand what is personal data and what isn't personal data. We at least have to ask ourselves that question, and where possible, provide reports only in aggregate form, de-identify the data, pseudonymize the data. And there's no one simple solution that will fit all the use cases, but there's a point at which we ask ourselves that question. We can enable big data for social good if we understand who is responsible. And many times in big data initiatives and projects, you get multiple parties. It's all about data sharing and pooling things. And we need to understand who is really responsible for what data. And particularly in Internet of Things age, there is a need to sort of consider that. And alongside that, I would also say governance comes into it, because it's all very well thinking about these issues, but you need to have some sort of governance mechanism, whether that's at an operator level, or if there are multiple stakeholders involved, then maybe there's a sort of some other sort of form of umbrella governance. But these are just considerations, things to think about. We can enable big data for social good if we think about the risks and impacts to individuals and groups of individuals. As has been mentioned a couple of times already, groups also, there are consequences potentially. So we need to have some system for assessing risk and impact. And I think organizations and our members certainly already do that kind of impact assessment for personal data projects. And again, another enabling area of privacy would be the transparency point. If we can get transparency right, then again, that is really powerful. And okay, everyone accepts that the age of producing a small notice before you collect the data is now very difficult to do. But there are other things we can do. We can explain things in a general way, that this kind of thing is a possibility, the circumstances in which it's a possibility, and we can explain if we do come up with some arrangement for, I don't know, disaster response, making available of data, then we can explain who has access to that data, for what reason, for what purpose, and how that all works. So there is transparency work that we can do to take people with us. And then there are a few other things, but to save time, I think one of the sort of crucial things for me as well is the ethical dimension, because as we go down this road, we are going to encounter tricky questions where the law doesn't necessarily give us an answer, and the privacy principles don't give us an answer, but we have to weigh difficult issues, and for that there needs to be some sort of ethical consideration going on. And I know that some of our members have also already done this individually, so again, we want to leverage some of the great work that's already taken place. And then, so just to finish off, my overall message in all this is that big data for social good and privacy are not enemies, they are friends that mutually support each other. And I think if we get the privacy right, that will enhance big data for social good. And I don't see it as an obstacle at all. As Fernando was saying, it's actually an enabling force. So I'll hand you back to Yanis.
Great, thanks, Boris. I think that was a great concluding remark. Now, before we sort of sum up, I wanted to sort of see if there are any more questions from the crowd. I know Mila wanted to do a very quick intervention on the question before on impact assessments. So, I don't know, Mila, are you still there?
Yes, hi.
Yep, can hear you. So.
Yes, I can hear you well. Thanks very much, Yanis. I guess the question was asked in the first session, and many comments were already made by the speakers in this second session. But I just wanted to add that I think, and echo on what just Boris has said and Mr. Sora, that I think risk management, especially in the big data context, is crucial. While we are saying, yes, we do need privacy laws and we do need regulatory standards, are we ready, or even if we do have that law, that even from the international perspective, will that be sufficient to cover issues that relate to big data? If we talk about consent, is consent always effective when we speak about big data, or when we speak about emergency situations or developing or least developed countries? So I don't think consent or set standards is the only answer. It's one of, but it's not the only answer to how big data or data in general could help social and public good. And I think risk management in general should be a very big part of the decision making. And someone asked in the first session about the impact assessment. So I think impact assessment should play a key role in how data is used for social good, especially in situations where there are no clear-cut answers, or where there are no laws in countries where, let's say, privacy or data protection regulations don't exist, or in the context of humanitarian or development response. I would say that many international humanitarian and development organizations are implementing risk impact assessment, or they call it risk, harms, and benefits assessment. In terms of big data, we actually just started exploring and finished, as I said, a first, I would say, part which has been published just today or yesterday, in understanding how risks, harms, and benefits correlate and can be assessed with each other, and make a decision whether the project should be taken on in the humanitarian and development context, taking into consideration all the crucial and very uncertain aspects of, for example, big data, or questions related to consent. How efficient is consent? Even if we do have that consent, we should always, I think, still assess how informed the consent was, and whether even the individual, the beneficiary of the project, has given it to you. You still need to assess the circumstances under which such consent has been given, has been taken. And I know that there are many international humanitarian organizations are working, for example, on policies and guidelines that actually include and tackle specifically on that aspect. So again, to summarize my remarks, is that it is important to include risk management, and risk management not only at the beginning of the project, but actually understand the risks and harms, and also those that relate to ethical implications of the use of data, taking into account the context, and engaging, if possible, representatives of the beneficiaries or beneficiaries themselves where possible, to understand that specific context or that specific cultural attitude, or that specific, let's say, societal factor that could influence the outcome of that project in that specific region versus the project in another region. And the same goes for consent. Even if the consent has been obtained and the project is, from the first glance, sounds like it's legitimate and lawful, and we still need to understand whether it's fair, and understand the risks and harms associated, even if the data is being used with consent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mila, once again. So I think we've got about 7-8 minutes for any more questions. I think there was a lady up there who I missed before, so I'll give you the floor first. If you can all be quite brief, if possible. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Diego Castañeda from Fundación Carisma, Colombia. I would like to ask or comment on why this emphasis on CDRs and communications metadata, because when you talk about what are we doing with big data in down to earth, we're talking about CDRs. It's kind of the main source of information, of data that we're processing or analyzing. So I think that's, we have to think about that, because we have on this side of the issue the metadata, but we have the CDRs for analysis, but on the other hand, we have this fight on recognizing metadata as part of communications in some places like Colombia. And you have to consider why producing and encouraging the production of this information may help abusive governments. And another point on that is that we have to think about why data protection may be limited to think about these issues, because it's not only about data protection in itself, but privacy in general, and the kind of the way we are using this information. And there was mention about the Ebola crisis and the use of metadata, and we have a very good report by CIS India. They talked about how ineffective, or the problems to effectiveness that were using CDRs in that crisis and other issues you can look at there. But it's not that effective, so we have to think about that. And the second part is that we are in Colombia, we're in the midst of producing a public policy on big data, and we're worried about this kind of hype we are all in about using big data for everything, like big data for health, big data for taxes, resource allocation. I think we need to think about prioritize what do we need to do with big data, because I think this hype is going to leave us in a worse position in terms of privacy. If we allow this to be a tool for everything, we don't think we can think about all the different issues. So that would be a thing to discuss.
Thanks for that intervention. Can I go at the back just to? Thank you.
Bien, muchas gracias. Buen día a todos. Mi nombre es Víctor Benavides. Pertenezco a ISOC en República Dominicana. Y mi pregunta va dirigida al señor representante del gobierno mexicano. Ya que en República Dominicana tenemos una nueva ley de protección de datos. ¿Cuál ha sido el mayor reto que ha tenido el gobierno de México para la aplicación de la ley de protección de datos, para la aplicación en el territorio mexicano? Pues son un país 100 veces más grande que República Dominicana, para ver cómo puede enfocarlo en nuestra ley de protección de datos.
Yeah, that's for you, Fernando. If you can focus on the big data aspect.
Sí, mira, como cualquier ley, cuando está en su estado embrionario, creo que el gran reto es un problema de cultura. Yo entiendo las normas de datos personales como una relación de corresponsabilidad. Es decir, el primer punto es que el ciudadano entienda los alcances de su autodeterminación informativa. Dos, los que tratan la información, es decir, el responsable del tratamiento de datos personales, entienda cómo debe cuidarlos, resguardarlos y protegerlos. Y por último, en el pináculo de esta arquitectura de la privacidad debe estar la autoridad. Si no entendemos este esquema de autorregulación, este esquema de corresponsabilidad, pues creo que no se tendría el éxito que se tiene actualmente en México. Ha habido un crecimiento de protección de datos, de procedimientos de datos personales, ha habido un crecimiento en los procedimientos de verificación. Somos un país con una cantidad inmensa de sujetos obligados por parte de entes privados, pero creo que el gran reto es esto, es una constante de estar capacitando al ciudadano y a los responsables de este nuevo reto. Yo creo que ese es el punto, que es un reto que vemos como de forma permanente en el instituto. Por eso tenemos varias guías, tenemos varios foros, tenemos varios mecanismos de capacitación. En la página oficial de nuestro instituto tenemos una cantidad de guías que pueden servir tanto al ciudadano como al responsable, como guías de medidas de seguridad, guías de destrucción segura, guías de principios de datos personales. Todo es creo que el reto, y es un reto en el sentido positivo, es el aspecto de cultura. Gracias.
Thanks very much, Fernando. Can I go over here? Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Leandro from the Association for Civil Rights in Argentina. My original question was to Fernando, but I think you kind of already answered. Was what are the limitations that DPAs face when trying to make companies comply with data protection laws regarding big data and how they manage the amount of information they collect? So I open the question for the whole panel, like what the role of DPA should be when trying to make companies comply with these standards.
In Mexico, at least, we are of the one most regulated industries. We were the first ones, or one of the first ones, to put a self-regulation plan in front of the regulator, and there has been, particularly in Mexico, for example, we have to keep data for public safety issues, and there has been a lot of discussion about what is our participation in those processes, what information do we have to provide the authorities? And how can we safe keep that information? So there is a lot of discussion about data protection in Mexico, and interaction between the regulator and ourselves is constant. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, thank you. I've no specific idea on this, but I'm saying it is crucial for telcos to accept, respect, and apply the national regulation everywhere, because it is a too sensitive issue. It is a too sensitive issue for moral issue, of course, but also for customers, maybe for competition. And I think we need to have as clear rule as possible. I understand that regulation, legislation probably can't solve anything because it's a very complex, and ethics, techniques, and so on, and is part in this process. But we absolutely need very clear rules that all of the telecom companies inside of the legislation they have to respect, because the telecom company are embedded in a huge legislation process in every country, with talks with the regulators and so on. So the idea we have in this Opal experiments is clearly to put everything on the table, speak on everything with national authorities, with telecom companies, and see what's happened. But at the end, I think it is absolutely crucial to have clear rules. At the end, I'm not convinced that it is so much more difficult that the legal issue of protection of any kind of data. For example, in health, it is classical and a very old issue. You have to protect the health, but also you have to accept to communicate some health information for statistic and any kind of public health progress.
Maybe just 2 points on that. One, we're talking about big data, and as was mentioned earlier as well, we've got public-private partnerships, and so a lot of data protection frameworks that are in place don't necessarily apply to both of those actors, and so there's already a limitation there. The second one is, using Leandro's question to raise this concern, is which DPA are we talking about? Because with the different actors, transborder sharing, collection, generation, use of data, are we talking about the DPA who has jurisdiction in the country where the data is collected, where the decision or whatever initiative is implemented, or where actually the beneficiary is? So I think there's also these questions about which DPA holds the responsibility and at what point of the process.
Thanks, Alexandrine. Just one final question. Let's go there.
Hi. I mean, my point was more of a general comment than a specific question. But the point that I wanted to make was, I'm Amber from CIS India. I think when we talk of ethical considerations with respect to using big data for social good, often we frame the question primarily in the context of privacy. And this was sort of this provocative question that I wanted to put forth. Was, would it make more strategic sense to frame those questions in the context of other theories of law, such as anti-discrimination law? Because the trouble with privacy is that most of the data protection frameworks globally focus more at the stage of collection of data, and they put the onus on the individual to make informed choices based on privacy notices and other kinds of information provided to them. Now, in the era of big data, when there is such indiscriminate collection, and often collection is in very sort of implicit forms through IoTs and through smart cities. So in that context, maybe a legal framework or discussions around a legal framework which moves the focus away from data collection to actual use cases of data and their impact, which could possibly be addressed through anti-discrimination law or competition law. It might make sense, or do you guys think that it might make sense to move the conversation a little more towards those legal theories?
I mean, I think a number of the speakers touched on some of the issues you raised. I don't know if Boris, do you want to tackle the ethical considerations points? Just very quickly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think that highlights very well why we can't just view the privacy considerations in isolation, and why we need to remind ourselves of a sort of bigger ethical picture. Quite how we introduce those questions, I think, remains to be developed. And you could develop a whole sort of privacy structure that has an impact assessment and an ethical hook on it, and introduce those questions through that. Or you could do it, as you're suggesting, to maybe tackle some of those ethical considerations completely outside that. So I think both of those things work. And Yanis, if I may just go back to the previous question as well, I think there's an important sort of message I was hearing at the International Privacy Commissioners Conference in Morocco recently, is that, and I'm hearing it more and more, is that regulators need to be smart nowadays. Of course, their role is to enforce the law in their country, but also they need to prioritize, and they need to do that smartly, and they need to be selective to be effective. They need to have a sort of risk-based approach to their enforcement, and also think about the economy and the economic impacts of their activities, as well as just the fundamental rights. Those things do go together, and of course to talk to each other as well. Just thought I'd throw that in, if I may.
Thanks, Boris. I'm just conscious of time, so I guess just to very briefly sum up the key points that I've noted during the discussion. So yes, we agree that there's overall consensus that privacy is fundamental in the big data world, whether it's social good or not. So that's definitely established. We've also seen that operators are working on a number of initiatives, and they have all been thinking about privacy by design and applying those principles to their own initiatives. Both Telefonica and Orange talked about one of the options on tackling privacy, which is around sort of transporting the algorithm to the data rather than sharing the data itself, and doing the analysis in a controlled environment. Alexandrine talked about the human rights sort of aspects and the challenges around privacy that the big data world sort of raises. I think we've also talked about the need for partnerships between different players, touching on the laws, as Fernando noted, and Boris as well. So there are more than 100 data protection and privacy laws around the world. So a big challenge is, if you're a multinational player, what laws do you comply with? And there's a need to sort of reduce regulatory uncertainty. And again, as Boris mentioned, privacy principles are a great step to ensuring that all MNOs and other players are playing in the same sort of field. And I think we also touched on regulatory and laws around the world that are hopefully enabling innovation in this space rather than being a barrier. And self-regulation, I think that's fundamental, given this disparity of laws across borders. Industry self-regulation is definitely welcomed, and I think the GSMA is doing a lot of work around convening members and trying to make sure that there's a well-established self-regulatory framework in dealing with privacy. And I believe the last point was around the need for ethical considerations. And as big data raises challenges, for example, in how do you apply purpose limitation and other fundamental principles, that's where we have to think about the decisions we're taking when analyzing big data and the possible implications, not just on individuals, but also on groups of individuals, as many speakers mentioned, and what are the risks that are likely to arise if the analysis of data leads to misleading decisions. So I believe that was a great session, and thanks everyone for joining. So if you could join me for a big thank you to the panelists. Thanks very much.